The morning after her husband sold Thornfield Grange, Cecily Vane stood at the solicitor's door at 8:30, with her late father's bank drafts folded inside her glove. She had heard the news at dinner the previous evening, delivered across 12 feet of candlelit mahogany by the man who had her name on his marriage certificate, and nothing else of hers that mattered. He had said it with the flat satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally found the lever. The Grange, he told her, was gone. Sold to a speculator from Bristol for £11,000. The furniture would be catalogued next week. She might take her paints, he added, as a courtesy. She had not looked up from her plate. She had said very quietly that she hoped he had eaten enough, because the soup was cold. Then she had excused herself from the table, walked upstairs, and sat at her writing desk for an hour and a half with her father's letters spread before her, doing arithmetic. In the morning, she was at Hargreave & Sons before the ink on her husband's deed was fully dry. If you are still finding your way into this story, stay close. What Cecily did in the next 48 hours cost her everything her husband thought he had left her, and gave her back everything he had tried to take. It is not a simple story of spite returned for spite, though the surface of it looks that way. It is a story about what a woman knew, what she had quietly kept, and what happened when the man who finally saw her clearly was not the one who had chosen her first. The marriage to Sir Rowland Vane had been her mother's doing, arranged in the spring of Cecily's 21st year, when her father's health was already failing, and the family's London house was being quietly assessed by creditors. He was 43, a baronet with a sound income, and a cold manner that Cecily's mother had described, generously, as distinguished. He had a large estate in Hampshire, a London house, a perfectly adequate face, and no interest whatsoever in a wife's interior life. He wanted a quiet, capable woman of good family who would manage his household and not speak too loudly at his table. He had supposed Cecily would be that woman. He had been wrong on exactly one count. She was quiet. She was capable. She managed his household with an efficiency that impressed his steward and bored Rowland so completely that he ceased noticing her at all within 18 months of the wedding. She was not without interior life. She had, in fact, a great deal of it. She had her father's mathematical mind, her father's small fortune from his patent dealings, inherited through a trust so modest and correctly structured that Rowland had glanced at the number, supposed it was the sort of thing women kept for pin money, and had never looked at it again. He had not known that she had been quietly adding to it since the first year of their marriage, that a careful series of small investments placed through her father's old solicitor had nearly tripled the principal, or that she had, by her 28th year, enough to buy a house of modest proportion outright and live on what remained with careful management. She had not told him. She had told no one. Not from deception, but from a knowledge so specific and so early learned that it had ceased to feel like strategy. A woman's money, once noticed, became a man's money. She had kept it the way her father had taught her to keep anything valuable. Quietly. Without display. With patience. The Grange was not her own house. It was Rowland's family property, and she had come to it 6 years ago with her trunks and her paints and her small private income, and had spent those 6 years making it the most beautiful and well-ordered house in the county. She had restored the knot garden. She had rehung the gallery with her father's eye for balance. She had persuaded the head gardener to try a new variety of climbing rose on the south wall. She had supervised the drainage of the lower meadow and argued with Rowland's steward about the new copper pipes until the steward conceded she was right and had them installed anyway. The house had not been merely her residence. It had been her work. Rowland had known none of this in the way that a man knows a thing he has taken the trouble to understand. He knew the house was well regarded. He knew guests remarked on it. He attributed this, when he attributed it to anything, to the servants. It had not occurred to him that it was Cecily's doing, because it had not occurred to him that Cecily did things. And then the argument, the final one, the one that had no particular cause except the accumulated weight of 6 years of mutual irrelevance. She had disagreed with him at his own dinner table, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly and with specific reference to the drainage scheme he was proposing for the home farm, which would, she said in her perfectly level voice, destroy the source of the stream that fed the kitchen garden. He had not liked being corrected by his wife. He had not liked the faces of the men at the table going still in that attentive way. He had not liked the silence that had settled over the room while everyone waited to see who was right. And afterward, in the privacy of his study, he had resolved to sell the Grange. Not because it was sensible, not because he needed the money, because she had made it hers, and he was going to take it back. He had moved with uncommon speed. He had sold it within a week to the first credible offer, a speculator named Darville, who wanted the land for sheep, and did not especially care about the knot garden or the copper pipes. Cecily had heard the news at dinner and done her arithmetic at her desk and been at Hargreave & Sons at 8:30. What she had not anticipated was the man standing at the solicitor's outer door when she arrived, in the attitude of someone who had been there longer than she had. He was perhaps 35, slightly above middle height, with the kind of stillness that some men acquire not through birth, but through a great deal of having had to wait. He wore a dark coat, well made but not fashionable, and held his hat in both hands in a way that suggested he had removed it not out of ceremony but because he was too warm. His face was not immediately striking. It became striking, she would think later, gradually, the way a landscape does when you stand in it long enough to see what is actually there. His name was Mr. Edmund Hartley. He was the son of the man who had owned Thornfield Grange before his father had bought it out from under Hartley's grandfather, in circumstances that the county had long ago agreed to pretend had not happened in quite the way they had happened. He had spent 12 years in the West Indies managing a trading concern and had come back the previous autumn with enough money and just barely enough time to act, having heard through his solicitor that the Grange was changing hands again to present his own offer. He had been at Hargreave & Sons the previous afternoon. He had arrived this morning to confirm the deed. He was not, therefore, entirely pleased to find a woman in a plain gray carriage dress standing at the same door with the same purpose. They regarded each other in the cold morning light for the space of several seconds. She said, very politely, that she believed they might be here on the same matter. He said, equally politely, that he suspected she was correct. She said that she was prepared to offer £11,500 for the Grange, with deed of conveyance to be drawn immediately. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a flatness that she would later understand, was not coldness, but the voice of a man working out something difficult, that he was prepared to offer $11,400. There was a pause. She looked at him carefully. He looked back. She said that she had the bank drafts with her. He said, after another moment, that he did not. She said that she would go inside first. Then, he held the door. It was not the beginning she would have chosen for any story. She would tell it to her grandchildren exactly as it had happened, including the part about the bank drafts in her glove, because it was the truest piece of it, and the piece that explained everything else. The deed took 3 hours. Mr. Darville the speculator was sent for and arrived in poor temper and was soothed into agreement by the offer of an additional £50 and Hargreave's best Madeira. Her husband was not consulted because, under the terms of his hasty sale, the deed was already completed, and the Grange was Darville's to sell as he chose. This was the thing Roland had not considered. He had supposed the house would belong to a stranger, and Cecily would lose it. He had not supposed that the stranger would sell it back to anyone at all, and certainly not to his wife. The conveyance was drawn in her name. Her father's trust, properly named. She signed where Hargreave indicated and folded her copy of the deed and placed it in her reticule without expression. He had remained in the outer room for the 3 hours. She had not expected this. When she came out with the deed in her reticule, he was sitting in the straight-backed chair nearest the window, looking out at the street, and he did not turn when she entered. She studied his profile for a moment in the gray morning light. The line of his jaw, the quality of his stillness. There was something in his posture that she recognized as a specific kind of grief. The particular posture of a person who has missed something by a very small margin and is deciding how to bear it. She said, before she had quite decided to say anything, that she was sorry. He turned then, which she had not anticipated. He looked at her with a directness that was not impolite, but was quite unguarded in the way that men were rarely unguarded with women they had only just met, and she had the odd sensation of being seen, not assessed, not calculated, but simply seen as a person with a particular history who had just done a particular thing for what he might reasonably assume were opaque reasons. He said he would not have her be sorry. The Grange had been his family's once, and he had known returning that it might not be his again. That was the cost of leaving, she said. And she was not sure why she said it, except that the clarity of his face in that moment seemed to demand something honest in return, that she was not certain yet what she intended to do with it. He said that seemed to him a sound position for someone who had just bought a house in 3 hours. She found, to her own surprise, that she very nearly smiled. They stood in the solicitor's outer room for another few minutes, neither of them quite ready to end the conversation, both of them aware that the conversation was extending beyond any practical warrant. She told him about the knot garden and the copper pipes and the climbing rose on the south wall. He listened with the attention of a man who is hearing a description of something he has spent 12 years building in his mind from incomplete materials, and who finds the complete version more detailed and more interesting than anything he had imagined. He said his grandfather had planted that climbing rose. She said she had not known that. She said it was in very good health. He said quietly that he was glad. They parted at the door. He bowed. She inclined her head. She walked to her carriage and sat down and held her reticule in her lap with both hands, and found that her heart was beating in a way that had nothing whatsoever to do with bank drafts. She did not go to Roland. There was nothing left to say to Roland, and she had known that for some years. What she had not known, until that morning, was that there was a document that could make the knowing into a fact. She had written to her solicitor that afternoon to begin the proceedings that her father had once quietly told her were available, should she ever require them, to a woman who had maintained her own separate property and could demonstrate cause. The law was slow. It was slow by design, and she understood that. It had turned, and she felt the turning. She stayed that night at the small house in Winchester, where her friend Mrs. Alicia Penrose kept her own counsel and served very good tea, and asked, over the teacups, what Cecily intended to do with a Hampshire estate. Cecily said she intended to live in it. Alicia said, in the tone of a woman who had noticed a great many things, and was deciding whether to mention them, that she had heard the solicitor's clerk say that the previous bidder had come back and inquired about the gardener's cottage at the edge of the grounds. Cecily set her cup down. Alicia said, perfectly pleasantly, that the cottage was a separate parcel, technically, and had been included in Darvill's purchase, but not in yesterday's conveyance. She said Hargreave had mentioned it in passing. She said she believed the gentleman had inquired about it this morning, after Cecily had left. Cecily was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that the cottage needed its roof reshingled and the kitchen was too small. Alicia said, agreeably, that it did. And it was. Cecily said that she would need to speak to the gardener about the cottage. Alicia said she suspected the gardener would be very glad of the direction. It was not, Cecily told herself that evening, any kind of decision. It was a practical matter. She owned the estate. She would need to know who was living at its edge. It was stewardship, not sentiment. She had been steward of the Grange for 6 years, and she knew what good stewardship required. Attention, consistency, the willingness to walk the full perimeter. The letter she wrote that evening to Hargreave was about the cottage. It was a practical letter. She asked whether the cottage parcel had yet been settled, and whether the prospective purchaser, if there was one, would be amenable to discussing the terms with the estate's new owner, as the cottage sat within the grounds, and she would prefer to have the matter regularized before winter. It was a very sensible letter. She read it twice and sealed it. She did not write the other letter, the one that had formed itself in her mind while she was writing the sensible one. The letter that would have said something about the climbing rose and the person who had planted it, and the strange, specific comfort of talking to someone who heard the details of a place the way she heard them. She had spent 12 years hearing those details and having them received as nothing more than competence, which was a useful thing, a valued thing in a household, but not the same as being listened to. The distinction had mattered to her for a long time without her having a name for it. She was beginning to have one. She did not write that letter. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the window, and listened to the rain beginning against the glass. He came to the Grange on a Tuesday. He had written first a brief correct letter to the estate's owner requesting permission to walk the grounds once more, which he explained he had not done since the age of 9, when his father had brought him through the gates for the last time. He said he would understand if she preferred to refuse. He said he would leave no inconvenience and no trace of his visit. She had written back that he was welcome to walk the grounds whenever he chose, and that the gardener would expect him, and that the knot garden was best seen at 11 o'clock when the sun came over the east wall. He arrived at 11. She was in the garden, which was not a coincidence, because she had been in the garden every day at 11 since she had returned to the Grange 3 weeks ago, and resumed her ordinary life there, with the deed in her writing desk. And Roland's absence a kind of quiet relief she had not yet learned to name. She was wearing her second-best morning dress and her garden gloves, and when he came through the south gate, she was on her knees beside the border, doing something practical with the edging shears. She stood. She did not pretend she had not seen him. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the knot garden in its late autumn form, the box hedges trimmed to their careful geometry, the last of the lavender gone to seed, the gravel paths raked by someone who understood the point of raked gravel. He stood very still. She watched his face change, slowly, the way a face does when it is receiving something it was not sure it would ever receive. He said, in a voice that was very quiet, that he had not expected it to look like this. She said, what had he expected? He said something smaller, something more time-worn. He said in 12 years, memory tends to enlarge things, and he'd been prepared to find the real version disappointing. She said that the real version had been in some disrepair when she arrived. He looked at her then, and she did not look away, which was the thing that she had not intended. The thing that happened without her deciding it should happen. They stood on either side of the border with the late autumn light between them, and she was aware, with the specificity that her body sometimes offered in advance of her mind, of exactly how still he was holding himself. He said, carefully, that she had done something rare here. She said that she had done what the house required. He said, with the same carefulness, that most people did not see what a house required. She said nothing. She looked at the knot garden. She thought about the fact that her hands were in garden gloves, which was not, she decided, a circumstance she could do anything about now. He walked the grounds for 2 hours. She did not accompany him, but she watched from the upper gallery window when he went down to the lower meadow, and she saw him stop at the fence line where the drainage channel ran, and stand there for a long time looking at the new copper pipes with their clean institutional correctness, the engineering visible through the cleared bank, and she could not see his face from the gallery, but she saw his hand go up and rest on the fence post, and stay there. He came back through the house to thank her before he left, which was correct and proper, and which she had not expected to unsettle her as much as it did. He had been in the lower meadow for some time, and she had watched from the gallery until watching felt like something she should stop doing, and had gone downstairs and put the garden gloves on the table in the hall, and stood in the morning room trying to look as though she had been there all along. The room was well suited to it. She knew all of its angles and its light at this hour, the way the fire needed banking and the particular creak of the third floorboard near the door. She had made this room, as she had made all the rooms, into something that held its occupants well. She had not, until recently, thought about what it would feel like to be held in it herself. He was shown to the morning room. She was already there. She had moved from the gallery window to the morning room in a way that she did not precisely account for. She had removed the garden gloves. He thanked her with the brevity of a man who means it and does not need to ornament it. He said the house was in better keeping than he had imagined possible. He said he hoped it would give her everything she had worked for. She said, looking at him with the directness she had learned from her father and rarely deployed because it was not often useful, that she was not certain what she had worked for yet. He said, after a moment, that he had wondered that. She said she had wondered a great many things since the morning at the solicitor's. He said, and his voice was careful, but not cautious, that he had as well. A silence. The fire in the morning room. The clock. She said that the cottage was vacant, that the conveyance had come through, and she had taken possession of it with the grounds. She said the kitchen was too small, and the roof needed attention. She said the south-facing room on the upper floor had very good light. He was looking at her. She said, and she was aware that this was the line past which nothing could be unmade, that if a person were interested in the cottage, she would prefer to have someone in it who knew what the grounds required. Someone who might be, in the proper terms, a kind of neighbor. He was quiet for long enough that she became aware of the fire and the clock, and the particular quality of winter light through the morning room windows. Then he said, in a voice that was low and level and entirely committed, that he believed he knew the grounds reasonably well. She said she had thought he might. The cottage was let on terms that Hargreave arranged correctly and efficiently, and without apparent curiosity. The roof was reshingled before Christmas. He moved in at the beginning of December, with 3 trunks and a small desk and several crates of books on natural history and estate management that filled the south-facing room on the upper floor. Roland Vane discovered, in the 2nd week of December, that his wife had bought the Grange back. His solicitor told him. Roland sat in the chair behind his desk for a long time without moving, which was, in its way, the truest response he had ever had to anything she had done. It was not spite, this time, that held him still. There was a dinner at Alicia Penrose's house the 1st week of the new year, a small gathering of 12, and Edmund came because Alicia invited him on the grounds that he was new to the county, and it would do him good to know people, which was true as far as it went. Cecily had not known he would be there, She had told herself she did not particularly mind either way. She was wearing the dark green gown that she had not worn since her first year in London, because it had seemed in the years since like too much of a statement, and she had not, until recently, been a person in a position to make statements. He arrived after she did. She was speaking with Sir Frederick Ames about the local turnpike committee when she became aware, without looking, that he had entered the room. She could not have explained how she knew. She had not looked. Her body had registered it, the particular shift in her own posture, a slight straightening, a breath that arrived differently. She continued to speak about the turnpike committee with Sir Frederick for another 2 minutes, and then turned. And he was standing across the room talking to Alicia's husband, and he was looking at her. The dismissive label had traveled, as these things did, through the county's established channels. Lady Farrow, who was Roland's distant cousin, and had never especially liked Cecily, had been saying since November that the mistress had lost her senses entirely, that the purchase of the Grange was the act of a woman who had no understanding of her own position, that one could not simply buy one's way back into a house from which one's husband had, quite rightly, removed all sentiment. Lady Farrow said it at cards. She said it at the Ames Tuesday dinner. She said it to Mrs. Beaumont over port wine cake in the first week of December, and Mrs. Beaumont, who was kinder, said she thought it showed rather clear resolve and sound judgment, and she had looked at Cecily with the compressed expression of a person who had decided the world had gone lax. Cecily had heard it. She had heard all 3 versions. She had found that what she thought of her had exactly the weight that woman had assigned Cecily over the 6 years of her marriage, which was to say very little weight at all, which was the particular mercy of being overlooked by a person who overlooked everyone who did not already agree with them. What she had not expected was for the dismissal to be repeated at Alicia's dinner by Sir Frederick, who was not malicious but was uncareful, who said in the general company that he supposed the Vane business was a peculiar one, that Cecily had always seemed a quiet sort, and one could only assume that quiet sort of woman did these things for reasons one could not quite follow. He said he supposed Roland must be baffled. He said it with the expansive good nature of a man who could afford to find other people's difficulties interesting. There was a silence at the table. Not a long one. Long enough. Edmund Hartley said from his end of the table, in a voice that was perfectly level and required no volume to carry, that he had had occasion to walk the grounds of Thornfield Grange recently, and that the woman who had designed the drainage of the lower meadow and restored the knot garden to its original form was not a woman one described as quiet in the sense Sir Frederick appeared to mean. He said she had the kind of clarity that most men who owned land would spend 30 years trying to develop and rarely managed. He said this, he added, as someone who had spent 12 years managing drainage and gardens abroad, and knew what he was looking at when he saw it. Another silence. This one different. Sir Frederick said, pleasantly, that he had not meant anything particular by the word. He said, equally pleasantly, that he was sure of it. Cecily did not look at him during this exchange. She looked at her plate, because if she looked at him, she was not confident of her expression. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that was disproportionate to the occasion. She was aware of Alicia, across the table, maintaining a neutrally interested expression with what Cecily recognized as considerable effort. The dinner moved on. The dessert came. The candles were brought. When the party moved to the drawing room afterward, Edmund was at her side almost immediately, not with any abruptness, not in any way that anyone watching would have found notable, but with the quality of a man who has made a decision and is acting on it simply, without performance. He said in a low voice that he hoped he had not overstepped. She said, and she was looking at the fire, that he had said exactly what he meant. He said he had, yes. She said she had not often encountered that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he suspected she had encountered a great deal that was less than what she deserved, and that he was sorry for it, because she had made a house into something worth knowing, and no one had told her so. She looked up at him. The fire was behind him, and the candlelight, and the drawing room full of Alicia's guests, and none of it was particularly private. But he was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the knot garden, the direct, unguarded way. And she felt it precisely where she had felt the first climbing awareness of him, in the careful, contained center of herself that had been waiting, for longer than she could comfortably name, to be met with something that was genuine. She said very quietly that she had made the house for herself, that she had known, somewhere in the making of it, that she was building toward something she could not yet name. She said she thought she was beginning to understand what it had been toward. He did not move. He was very still, the way he had been at the fence line. His hand was at his side, not quite touching hers. She said, and it was barely above the level of the fire, that the cottage roof had been done very well. He said the south-facing room had very good light, and he had put the desk there, and he was finding it rather difficult to work at the desk because of the view. She said, with the smallest possible suggestion of a smile that she no longer had any inclination to suppress, that the view was the kitchen garden, which she believed he might have something useful to say about. He said he believed he had a great deal to say about it. She looked at the fire. He looked at her. The drawing room filled with the particular sound of a gathering that has moved into its comfortable middle hours, and in that warmth, in that ordinary December abundance, Cecily Vane felt something release in her that had been held for 6 years. Quiet and precise and unmistakable, like a key turned at last in a lock she had not known was locked. The legal proceedings took until the following October. Hargreave managed them with his characteristic economy of comment. The grounds were particular and sufficient, and Roland's solicitor accepted them with the expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation for some years. Roland himself, in the end, did not contest. He had gone to his sister's house in Bath and was reportedly comfortable there, and the county had long since found other things to discuss. The evening the decree was confirmed, Cecily sat in the morning room of the Grange with the document on her writing desk, and the fire burning low and the lamps not yet lit, and she found that she did not feel, as she had sometimes imagined she would feel, triumphant. She felt quiet. She felt the specific quiet of a room that has finally settled into the use it was meant for. There was a knock at the morning room door. It was Edmund, which she had known it would be, because he had been at the Grange that afternoon, on the ordinary pretext of discussing the South Meadows winter drainage, which was a topic on which they had found they could spend several hours without noticing the time. He came in without his coat, having been in the house long enough that the formality had worn off, and he looked at the document on the desk, and then at her, and he did not say anything for a moment. He sat in the chair across from hers, the one that had become, over the past several months, his chair in the way that things become a person's without anyone deciding it. He said finally that it was done. She said yes. He said, with the carefulness that was not caution, but its opposite. The care of a man who has learned that the right words, placed correctly, can bear a great deal of weight, that he would like, if she was willing, to say something. She looked at him. He said that he had come back to England to find what his family had lost, and that he had not found it, because it was already found, by a woman who had understood it better than his family ever had. He said he had been angry about that for approximately one morning, and had then realized that the person who had restored the thing he loved was someone he could not easily stop thinking about, and that this had been a source of some confusion for him over the past year, which she might have noticed. She said calmly that she had noticed. He said that he wanted, in plain terms, to ask her to marry him. Not for the house. He said this quite precisely. Not for the grounds, or the knot garden, or the South Meadows drainage. For her, he said. Because she was the most clear-headed and capable person he had met in 12 years abroad and 12 months at home, and because he found that he could not look at the kitchen garden from his desk without thinking of her, which was, he acknowledged, a somewhat irregular declaration, but was the truest one he had. She was quiet for a moment. The fire. The window. Dark now. The night outside it. She said that she would like, before she answered him, to tell him something she had not told anyone. He said she should. She said that when she had sat at her desk the night before she bought the Grange back, doing her arithmetic, she had known with perfect clarity that she was not doing it to spite Roland, and she was not doing it merely to have the house. She had known that she was doing it because she had built something in that house that deserved to continue, and because she was not, she had decided quite firmly, prepared to be a woman who surrendered the things she had built. She said she had made that decision in solitude, and she was content with it in solitude. She had, since December, been forced to revise her understanding of what solitude was going to look like, because a person who walked her meadows with that particular quality of attention was not, she found, a person she could simply disregard. He said nothing. She said, in plain terms, that yes, she would marry him. The fire settled in its grate. The clock kept its time. Outside, the winter garden lay in its careful order, the box hedges pale in the dark, the climbing rose on the south wall bare but alive, the roots of it deep in the ground where his grandfather had put them, where her hands had tended them, where they would come back in the spring as they always did, as certain as the light. He reached across the space between the chairs, and she put her hand in his, and they sat for a while in the room that had been her work, and would now be their life. Without needing to say anything further, because everything essential had already been said. If her story has moved you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that reached you most. Stories like this one are made for the people who stay until the quiet end. They married in April, in the small church at the edge of the village, with Alicia as the only person Cecily had thought to invite who wept with any conviction. Edmund had his own modest group of witnesses, including his old solicitor, who seemed, Cecily thought, as relieved as anyone in the room. The cottage at the edge of the grounds became a home for the head gardener and his young wife, who had been living in 2 small rooms in the village. The kitchen was expanded by August. The roof, Edmund had already seen to. The knot garden bloomed in May, and in June, and in July. And each time Cecily went through it in the mornings, she thought of the woman who had stood at the solicitor's door in the cold with the bank drafts in her glove, and felt something she could only name as recognition of that woman, of what she had been capable of the long, careful work of understanding what one's life was actually worth and what it was worth attempting. The climbing rose on the south wall had a second season of particular abundance that year. Edmund said his grandfather had chosen well. Cecily said she agreed. She had her hand in his, and the light was soft through the old glass of the morning room window, and outside the meadows ran down to the drainage channel in their ordered way, and the house stood as it had always stood, patient and particular, waiting for the people who knew what to do with it. She did not think of Roland. There was nothing left of that story to think with. It had become like the worn edges of a dress taken apart and made into something else entirely, unrecognizable in its new form. Not a marriage, not a failure, But the precise and peculiar circumstance that had brought her to stand at a solicitor's door at 8:30 on a cold morning, with 12 years of quiet arithmetic in her glove, ready to buy back what she had already built. She was glad of all of it, even the hard parts. She was especially glad of the door. Edmund found her there sometimes, on the mornings when the light came in at the angle that made the whole kitchen garden glow briefly gold, standing at the window with her tea going cold in her hand. He never asked what she was looking at. He simply came and stood beside her and looked at it with her. And after a while they went together into the day.